The airport bustled with its usual mix of chaos and order. Flight announcements echoed overhead, rolling luggage wheels clattered across polished floors, and voices rose and fell in 100 different languages. The scent of strong coffee from a nearby kiosk mingled with the faint tang of jet fuel drifting in whenever the sliding glass doors opened. For most people, the terminal was simply a place of transition, where journeys ended and began. But for Nadia Nelson, the black cleaner, it was her workplace, a space she knew intimately in ways travelers never noticed. At 26, Nadia wore the navy blue uniform of the cleaning staff, her dark hair pulled back into a neat bun beneath a cap, and her hands already roughened from long hours with mop handles and disinfectants. Her cart squeaked slightly as she pushed it down the concourse, her eyes scanning the smudges on glass and abandoned coffee cups littering the seats. While others rushed for flights, Nadia moved steadily, quietly making the vast airport a little more bearable for everyone else. Her body ached from exhaustion. She had been on her feet for nearly 10 hours, and it wasn't even her last shift of the week. With her parents gone, raising her younger brother and sister had fallen to her. Bills didn't wait, rent didn't pause, and groceries seemed to vanish faster than she could replace them. Cleaning floors wasn't her dream, but it was honest work, and it paid enough to keep food on the table and lights in the house. That was what mattered. Still, Nadia refused to let bitterness seep into her. She had seen too many coworkers grow hard and angry with life's weight pressing on them. Instead, she chose kindness whenever she could, even if it cost her extra effort. Perhaps that was why, when she noticed a small boy wandering the concourse with tears spilling down his cheeks, she instinctively abandoned her cart. "Hey there, sweetheart," Nadia said gently, crouching to his level. "Are you lost?" The boy hiccuped, wiping his nose with the back of his hand. I can't find Mommy." Nadia's heart tightened. "Don't worry. We'll find her together." She offered her hand, and after a brief hesitation, the child slipped his tiny fingers into hers. With patience, she led him toward an information desk, speaking softly all the way to keep his fear at bay. Within minutes, a frantic mother appeared, scooping the boy into her arms with tears of relief. She thanked Nadia profusely, but Nadia only smiled, waved off the gratitude, and quietly returned to her cart. Her supervisor, a sharp-faced woman named Ms. Carver, stood waiting. Arms folded, she tapped her clipboard. "Nelson, you can't just abandon your station whenever you please. Do you know how many complaints I get about messy gates?" "I'm sorry," Nadia said, bowing her head slightly. "There was a lost child. I couldn't just leave him." Carver's lips thinned. "Your job is cleaning, not babysitting. Do it again, and you'll lose hours." She walked away briskly, heels clicking on the tile. Nadia swallowed the sting of unfairness. It wasn't worth arguing. She picked up her mop again, humming softly under her breath to keep herself steady. She thought the day would pass like so many others. Work, fatigue, then the bus ride home. But fate had other plans. At gate 23, Edward Marshall shuffled into the terminal. His return flight had been delayed, and after 12 hours of travel from a quiet retreat in Switzerland, the 72-year-old was bone-tired. His suit was simple, just a beige cardigan, slacks, and well-worn loafers. He preferred comfort to grandeur, though few would believe he was the father of Lewis Marshall, one of the most powerful billionaires in the country. Edward had built his own fortune decades ago but never flaunted it. He believed a man's worth was measured by his integrity, not his wallet. Pulling his rolling suitcase, he felt the weight of fatigue in his chest. He had been stubborn about traveling alone, insisting to his son that he didn't need an assistant hovering over him. But as dizziness swept over him near the boarding gates, he realized maybe Louis had been right. His knees buckled slightly, his grip on the suitcase loosening. Dozens of travelers brushed past, their eyes fixed on departure boards, their headphones drowning out the world. Not one stopped. To them, Edward was just another weary old man in the crowd. But Nadia noticed. From where she was wiping down a row of seats, she saw him sway dangerously. Abandoning her rag, she hurried across the concourse. "Sir?" Are you all right? She asked, slipping an arm beneath his elbow just as his balance faltered. Edward blinked, grateful for the steadying touch. Oh dear. Must have stood up too quickly. Let's get you seated. With surprising strength, Nadia guided him to a nearby chair. She crouched in front of him, concern etched in her features. Do you feel faint? Do you need me to call medical? He waved weakly. No, just a little dizzy. It'll pass. Nadia wasn't convinced. She pulled a small water bottle from her cart and pressed it into his hand. Sip slowly. You might be dehydrated. Then, after a pause, she opened her lunchbox. Inside was a modest sandwich wrapped in foil, the meal she had planned to stretch across her break. She unwrapped it and held it out. Here, you should eat something light. Edward stared at her, surprised. That's your lunch. She smiled faintly. Lunch can wait. You need it more than I do. Something in her tone, so matter-of-fact, so genuine, struck Edward. He hesitated, then accepted, taking a careful bite. Slowly, the color returned to his cheeks. Thank you, he said after a few minutes. Most people just walked past. Nadia shrugged, sitting on the edge of the chair beside him. People are busy, they don't always notice, but I couldn't leave you struggling like that. Edward studied her face. She was young, clearly tired, yet her eyes held warmth. What's your name, miss? Nadia Nelson. A fine name, he murmured. Do you work here long? Almost 3 years now, she said, twisting her cap nervously. It pays the bills. I've got younger siblings at home. They depend on me. She glanced at him apologetically. Sorry, I don't mean to complain. Not at all, Edward said kindly. You speak with honesty, not complaint. They talked for a while, about her long hours, about how she dreamed of going back to school one day, maybe studying nursing, about how hard it was to juggle responsibility and hope at the same time. Edward listened closely, his heart warming. Here was a young woman carrying burdens far heavier than her age should allow, yet she hadn't let bitterness sour her spirit. Finally, he rose, steadier now. You've done more for me in 10 minutes than most people would in a lifetime. Nadia chuckled softly. It was nothing. It was everything, Edward corrected, his voice firm. You didn't know who I was. You had nothing to gain. That is what makes your kindness remarkable. Nadia tilted her head, puzzled by the weight of his words. I just helped someone who needed it. That's all. Edward smiled, eyes twinkling. And that's why I will never forget you, Miss Nelson. With that, he gathered his suitcase and gave her hand a grateful squeeze before heading toward the exit. Nadia watched him go, shaking her head at the strangeness of the encounter. She would likely never see the old man again. Her supervisor's voice soon called her back to work, and she returned to her cart, thinking only that she had done what anyone should have. But Edward Marshall walked out of that airport with his heart stirred in a way it hadn't been in years. He knew kindness when he saw it, and he knew also that his son, brilliant, powerful Louis, had forgotten what that looked like. Perhaps, Edward thought with quiet conviction, fate had just introduced him to the very person who could remind Louis of what truly mattered. And so the day ended, with Nadia believing it ordinary and Edward knowing it was anything but. Edward Marshall returned home in the late afternoon, the soft hum of his private helicopter fading as he stepped onto the sprawling terrace of his mansion. He felt unusually light despite the hours of travel and dizziness at the airport. Something about the young cleaner he had met, Nadia Nelson, had left a mark on him. Her kindness, so effortless and genuine, had stirred memories of simpler times when people's character mattered more than their wealth. As Edward entered the house, he found his son, Louis Marshall, in his study, reviewing a stack of documents with meticulous intensity. Louis's office overlooked the manicured gardens below, and the setting sun caught the edges of his sharp features, highlighting the tension lines that had appeared over years of managing Marshall Enterprises. Father, Louis said without looking up, how was your trip? Edward smiled, removing his coat. Eventful, in an unexpected way. Louis finally glanced at him, raising an eyebrow. Unexpected how? Did someone lose your luggage again? Edward chuckled softly. No, not luggage. A young woman helped me at the airport. Louis's expression hardened. A cleaner? Yes. Nadia Nelson. She noticed I was unsteady and took the time to sit with me, offer water, even share her lunch. She didn't know who I was, nor did she expect anything in return. Louis's eyes narrowed. And you're telling me this as if it's remarkable? It is remarkable, Edward said firmly, taking a seat in the chair opposite his son. In all my years, I've met countless people who fawn over wealth, who offer smiles for favors, who pretend to care. But this young woman, she was genuine. She helped me because it was the right thing to do, not for recognition or reward. Louis leaned back, crossing his arms. Sounds like a nice story. But people are rarely that selfless. Are you sure she wasn't angling for something? A tip, attention, or even a future position? Edward's gaze met his son's, unwavering. She had nothing to gain. That is precisely why it matters. Do you remember what I used to tell you, Louis? That wealth is meaningless if your character is compromised? Louis shifted uncomfortably. I remember. But it's different now. People are practical. They don't do good for the sake of good. They do it to benefit themselves. That's why she stands out, Edward said softly. I want you to meet her. Louis's reaction was immediate and defensive. Father, I don't need lessons on morality from a cleaner. I handle reality. Business is about results, not fairy tales. Edward leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. This isn't a lesson in business, Louis. It's a lesson in humanity, and perhaps it's a lesson you desperately need. Louis stared at him, tension coiling in his jaw. He wanted to dismiss the conversation, to return to spreadsheets and contracts, but something in his father's tone made him hesitate. Edward had always been grounded, a man whose wisdom had guided Louis even in his most ambitious endeavors. I don't see what she has to do with me, Louis muttered reluctantly. She reminds us of what matters most, Edward said. Kindness, integrity, empathy. You may have surrounded yourself with people who only see your status, but she doesn't. That's rare, Louis, and that's why she deserves your attention. A few days later, Edward arranged for Nadia to come to Marshall Enterprises, though she was unaware of his plan. He had called the headquarters under the guise of arranging an enhanced cleaning contract for a few temporary projects. Nadia, ever diligent, agreed, thinking of the extra income it would bring. Her first day at the sprawling corporate headquarters was overwhelming. The marble floors gleamed, the elevators were silent and smooth, and staff in tailored suits hustled past, each absorbed in their own world. Nadia pushed her cart quietly, doing her work efficiently, cleaning conference rooms and reception areas, all while noticing the smallest details that often went ignored. Late that afternoon, Louis Marshall happened to be walking down the corridor, engrossed in reviewing a proposal for a new acquisition. He rounded the corner and froze. Standing before him, pushing a cleaning cart, was a young woman, whose face seemed familiar, though he couldn't place her immediately. Excuse me, he said sharply, his tone commanding. Who are you? Nadia startled. Oh, I'm just cleaning. I work here. Contract cleaning, sir. Louis's eyes narrowed. At this hour? In the executive corridors? Before Nadia could respond, Edward appeared at the doorway, smiling warmly. Louis, meet Nadia Nelson, the young woman I told you about. She helped me at the airport. Louis looked from his father to Nadia, suspicion flickering across his face. The cleaner? Edward nodded. The very same. She's here for work. But more importantly, she's here to remind you that genuine kindness exists in this world, something you've perhaps forgotten. Nadia, feeling awkward under Louis's intense gaze, nodded politely. It's an honor to meet you, sir, she said, her voice steady despite the tension. Louis's pride resisted acknowledgement. He had spent years believing that people only acted out of self-interest, and yet Something in Nadia's calm, earnest demeanor unsettled him. She didn't fawn, didn't overcompensate, didn't ask for anything. She simply existed, with integrity. Over the following weeks, Louis observed Nadia silently. He noticed how she treated everyone, from security guards to administrative staff, with the same respect and courtesy she had shown his father. She didn't whisper to colleagues about who she thought was important. She didn't linger near his office hoping for a glance or favor. She cleaned, she smiled when appropriate, and she helped wherever it was needed. One afternoon, Louis found himself watching from his office window as Nadia assisted a tired delivery man struggling with a heavy box. She smiled at him, offering encouragement as she steadied the package. Louis felt a strange sensation, admiration mixed with unease. He had never been used to observing people for reasons other than efficiency or influence. Edward noticed Louis's change in demeanor. One evening as they walked through the gardens, he nudged his son gently. "You've been watching her," Edward said with a knowing smile. Louis's jaw tightened. "I'm observing, yes, but only because she's different. I've never seen someone like her in my world." Edward laughed softly. "Exactly. And that is precisely why she matters. Not because of what she can do for you, but because of who she is." Louis said nothing, staring at the sunset reflecting over the fountains. For the first time in years, he considered the possibility that his judgment of people, his rigid assumptions, might be flawed. Perhaps he had been too quick to distrust, too quick to assume selfishness where there was none. Meanwhile, Nadia continued her work with diligence, unaware of the impact she was having. She remained humble, never seeking recognition, her motivations always sincere. She spoke to employees as equals, helped those struggling with tasks, and never allowed the hierarchy around her to intimidate or change her. Louis found himself drawn into a quiet internal conflict. He wanted to dismiss her as inconsequential, a mere cleaner. But her consistency, her kindness, and her unwavering dignity challenged every cynical belief he held about human nature. Edward, watching from a distance, felt a swell of pride. He had hoped Louis would encounter someone who reminded him that wealth didn't define a person's worth, and Nadia was doing exactly that. Slowly, the edges of Louis's hardened demeanor began to soften. One afternoon, Edward invited Nadia to his study for a brief conversation, wanting Louis to witness her without pressure. "Miss Nelson," Edward began, "your work here has been exemplary. Not because it is meticulous, though it is, but because of your character. It's a rare gift." Nadia blushed. "Thank you, sir. I just do my best, that's all." Edward smiled. "And that's enough to make a profound difference." Louis, sitting nearby, watched silently. He realized that his father wasn't just praising her work, he was pointing out qualities he himself had overlooked. The realization was unsettling. He was a man used to controlling situations, analyzing people for weakness, and expecting loyalty in exchange for opportunity. And yet here was a young woman whose worth was intrinsic, untouched by his world of power and influence. As the days passed, Louis began to reflect on his own behavior. He saw himself in stark contrast to Nadia. He realized he often measured people by what they could do for him, while she measured others by their humanity. Her integrity challenged his worldview. Edward, ever patient, allowed Louis to reach his own conclusions. He understood that lessons learned under pressure were more enduring than lessons taught through words alone. Watching Nadia's quiet acts of compassion, he saw the transformation begin. Louis's posture relaxed, his frown softened, and his gaze, once critical and calculating, became contemplative. For Nadia, each day remained consistent. She worked hard, helped where she could, and remained unaware of the influence she was having on the most powerful man in the building. Yet, the ripple effects of her kindness were already spreading, unseen, but undeniable. By the end of the chapter, Louis found himself lingering near her workstation longer than necessary, observing how she engaged with others, silently questioning his assumptions and prejudices. Edward watched with a small, knowing smile. The young cleaner who had helped him at the airport had entered their lives in a way that neither Edward nor Louis could have anticipated, and her presence promised to bring lessons, growth, and perhaps something even more profound into their carefully structured world. The weeks following Nadia Nelson's quiet but remarkable integration into Marshall Enterprises passed with a surprising rhythm. Nadia's diligence, humility, and consistent kindness continued to impress Edward, and gradually, even Louis Marshall began to acknowledge her presence in ways he hadn't anticipated. His curiosity had shifted from suspicion to genuine respect, though he still maintained his carefully measured distance, unsure how to reconcile his fascination with the realities of their social and economic divide. Meanwhile, Nadia's life outside the company grew more complicated. Despite working tirelessly, her financial situation remained precarious. One afternoon, she received a letter from her younger brother's school, sternly reminding her of unpaid fees. Another notice indicated the landlord had issued an eviction warning. She tried to remain composed, brushing the issues off during her shifts, never allowing her personal struggles to interfere with her work. She had learned to shoulder burdens silently, believing that no one else's problems should be complicated by her misfortune. Edward, ever perceptive, became aware of Nadia's situation without her needing to speak of it. He had noticed subtle signs: her nervous glances at letters she received in the mail, the occasional hesitation before she sat to eat her modest lunch, the faint lines of worry etched onto her face even as she smiled at colleagues. Privately, he shared this information with Louis one evening during a late walk through the mansion gardens. "Louis," Edward said gently, "I believe Nadia is facing hardships that she does not wish to disclose. She carries the weight quietly, yet she continues to act with integrity and grace." Louis's first instinct was to offer financial aid, a simple, quick solution. But Edward stopped him. "Do not reduce her worth to charity alone. Understand her dignity, understand her character. That is how you approach this, if you wish to truly help." Louis paused, considering his father's words. It was not his usual approach. He had spent years offering assistance in ways that required little engagement or thought, checks, favors, and privileges. But Edward was asking him to look deeper, to act with intentionality, respect, and discretion. A week later, Edward arranged for Nadia to be offered a small administrative role within Marshall Enterprises, disguised as a routine promotion opportunity. When she received the invitation, she was stunned. I don't know what to say," she murmured. She had been content with her cleaning position, never imagining advancement could reach someone like her. "You earned it," Edward said, smiling. "Not because of what you do for me or this company, but because of who you are. The position is yours if you choose it." Nadia's humility prevented her from immediately accepting. She bowed her head. "I'm not sure I'm qualified, sir. I've only worked as a cleaner." Edward shook his head. "Your diligence, empathy, and intelligence are what matter. The rest can be learned. Trust yourself." When Louis first interacted with her in this new role, he noticed her poise and confidence. She carried herself with the same humility and kindness, yet there was a quiet strength in her that demanded recognition without seeking it. For Louis, the effect was profound. He began to see her not just as a cleaner or a helper, but as a person of extraordinary depth. The transformation in their relationship continued subtly over the following weeks. Louis, who had always been wary of trust, found himself seeking Nadia's perspective on mundane office matters, simply because he valued her honesty. She never flattered, never manipulated, never attempted to impress. Her guidance was straightforward, practical, and rooted in sincerity. For a man accustomed to people bending to his authority, this was a revelation. Then came the charity gala. Edward insisted Nadia attend as his guest, explaining that it was time she experienced the world she had impacted without being overshadowed by her circumstances. Nadia was initially hesitant, feeling out of place among the glittering gowns, tailored suits, and polished smiles of the city's elite. "You'll be fine," Edward encouraged. "Just be yourself. That is more than enough." At the gala, the contrast between Nadia and the other attendees was stark. yet she moved with quiet dignity, smiling warmly and greeting others politely. When whispers arose among the elite, subtle jabs at her background or simplicity, Lewis's protective instincts flared. For the first time in a long time, he publicly defended someone without concern for appearances or protocol. "She is here because of her character, not her status," Louis said firmly, addressing a cluster of socialites who had looked down their noses at Nadia. "And that is the kind of person worth respecting." The revelation of her identity, or rather her impact, culminated when Edward gently revealed to Nadia that the man she had helped at the airport was not only Edward Marshall himself, but also the father of one of the most influential men in the country. Nadia's eyes widened in disbelief. "You mean, the old man I helped is Edward Marshall?" Edward nodded. "And your kindness toward him has already changed the world around you more than you can imagine. Louis has learned from you just as I have." Nadia's hands trembled slightly, her humility preventing her from taking in the full significance of the moment. "I didn't. I just did what anyone should have done." Edward smiled. "And that is exactly why it matters. You didn't help me because of who I am, but because of who you are. That is rare, Miss Nelson. That is remarkable." Louis watched the exchange, an unfamiliar emotion stirring in his chest. Gratitude, admiration, and something deeper, more personal. He realized that the cynicism he had carried for so long had shielded him from seeing the beauty of human character. And now, standing beside Nadia, he felt a connection that defied the walls he had built around himself. Days turned into weeks, and Nadia settled into her administrative role with surprising ease. She became a respected figure within the office, not because of nepotism or wealth, but because of her work ethic and integrity. Her colleagues grew to rely on her guidance, and even the most skeptical employees acknowledged her quiet influence. Louis found himself increasingly drawn to her presence. He admired the way she treated others with respect, the patience she showed in tense situations, and the quiet resilience that underpinned every action. For the first time, he considered what it meant to value someone beyond status, appearance, or utility. One evening, Edward invited Louis and Nadia to the mansion for dinner, a small, private gathering meant to celebrate her contributions. As they walked through the garden under the soft glow of lanterns, Edward looked on with quiet satisfaction. The man who had once been skeptical, distant, and guarded was beginning to change, guided not by wealth or ambition, but by the simple, unwavering kindness of a young woman. During dinner, laughter flowed easily. Nadia's stories of her siblings, her small triumphs, and her quiet struggles touched everyone, including Louis. He listened intently, realizing how much he had missed in life by judging people through the lens of suspicion and practicality. He saw now that true strength lay not in the accumulation of wealth or power, but in character, empathy, and the courage to act with integrity. As the evening drew to a close, Edward leaned over to Nadia. "You've done more than you realize. You've changed more than one life. Mine, Louis's, and your own. Never underestimate the impact of simple kindness." Nadia smiled softly, feeling a warmth she had rarely allowed herself to accept. "I never expected anything in return," she said quietly. "I just tried to do what was right." Edward nodded, eyes twinkling. "And that is precisely why it matters. You didn't know who I was, yet you acted with heart. That will always be remembered." Louis, standing nearby, felt an emotion he had not allowed himself to acknowledge in years: vulnerability. He realized he had been transformed by her presence, her courage, and her unwavering humanity. He stepped closer, his voice low and steady. "Miss Nelson," he said, He paused, unsure of how to continue. "I want to thank you. Not for helping my father, but for showing me what it means to truly see people for who they are. You've changed how I see the world." Nadia looked at him, her expression soft but composed. "I only did what anyone should do," she said. "You did more than that. Louis insisted. You've changed me, and I can't ignore that. Edward watched the exchange with quiet pride. The moment was delicate, yet powerful. The billionaire who had once trusted few, who had measured worth in influence and wealth, was opening his heart because of a young woman whose only currency was kindness. By the end of the evening, the bond between Louis and Nadia was undeniable. It was built on mutual respect, shared integrity, and the realization that true wealth lay not in accounts or assets, but in the depth of human character. Edward's heart swelled with satisfaction as he observed them walk together along the garden paths, speaking quietly, laughing softly, and sharing a newfound understanding of trust, humanity, and connection. The world around them, the glittering city, the bustling corporate empire, and even the vast mansion itself, felt different now. It was no longer defined solely by power or status, but by the relationships forged through authenticity and compassion. And so, in the quiet aftermath of an ordinary act of kindness at a crowded airport, lives had been irrevocably changed. Nadia's courage and integrity had restored hope. Louis had learned to see the world with clarity and empathy, and Edward had been reminded that sometimes the smallest gestures carry the greatest weight. The billionaire who once believed trust and kindness were rare had discovered their true power, and the cleaner who acted without expectation had transformed more than just one life. Together, they had woven a story of redemption, humanity, and connection that neither wealth nor circumstance could have predicted, a story that would endure long after the airport encounter that started it all. Thank you so much for watching and supporting my channel. Your love, comments, and shares mean everything to me. Grateful for each of you. Let's keep growing together. With love from Whispers of Hope.